Welcome back, viewers at home. We're about to really dissect the whole conversation around the VAT increase, and I am joined by Dr. Dale T. McKinley to provide deeper insight into the implications of the VAT hike. Now, Dr. Dale is an economist with experience in financial analysis, with a unique combination of academic knowledge and real-world expertise in the South African economy. And tonight he is joining us to just share his perspective on the recent VAT hike as well as its potential impact. Dr. Dale, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, just getting started on our question, I think my first question for tonight will be just understanding, the broader sense of what VAT increase will bring about to the economy. And this brings me to say, what is the broader economic significance of the VAT increase for South Africa's fiscal stability as well as growth prospects?
Well, there's a big debate about how we raise revenue in South Africa. And I think the critique of the VAT and VAT is that it is a regressive tax. In other words, it hits everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're a millionaire or whether you live in an informal settlement, you're going to pay the same for most of the goods that you purchase. So it's not a particularly progressive tax, and I think that is the problem. So it's not about whether or not it's going to have a real fundamental impact on our fiscal stability. I think the bigger question is the impact it has on consumers, the impact it has on people's ability to actually buy basics, particularly food and transport and education and other kinds of things. So in that context, the impact could be a lessening, a dampening of consumer confidence, less spending in the economy. That then means less growth. That then means, that we don't have as much capital circulating in the economy. And that could dampen the growth prospects, and that could basically put paid to our expectations that were at the beginning of the year that our economy would be growing at least a decent tick this year. So I think the VAT is the real question is it the right way to raise revenue? And I think that's where the debate lies. Its impact in terms of the macroeconomic overall is going to be fairly minimal. The vast majority of the impact is going to be felt by individual consumers.
I want to come back to that thought with regards to, looking at other avenues in terms of, generating revenue for the economy. But before that, I want to just understand from you in terms of what would you say are the potential long-term repercussions of relying on VAT hikes as a means of generating revenue? Because we know that this is not the first time a VAT increase happened, and we're seeing that now it's happening at the cost, as you mentioned now, at the cost of households, because now it's looking at, decreased circulation of money in that sense. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think that the impact here is one of our economy is in a difficulty. We're having basically a situation where expanded unemployment is 40%, and where a large number of people who've been retrenched are having a real problem just getting by. And what VAT does as a tax is it basically puts added pressure on households, particularly those that are already being squeezed in the context of this sort of downturn in the economy. Now, this is happening in a context where the United States and the Trump administration has just announced tariffs on South Africa significantly, where markets are reacting very negatively to that sentiment, where the GNU seems to be in trouble as well. So you combine all those political and economic sort of uncertainties, and you put that on top of that. And it has the potential, as I say, to basically dampen our economy in that context. And I think that my personal opinion, I think of a minority of economists or political economists, that should never have been considered. And we're going to talk, obviously, about what those alternative sources of raising revenue would be. But VAT is something in an economy with such inequality, in an economy which has such high unemployment rates, to basically rely on that to plug your debt or to plug your gap in your budget is a very mean-spirited, I think, economic decision, because basically it's going to affect those that are least able to absorb that increase and absorb that shock. And I think that's the fundamental political point that I want to make. It's not simply just about economics. It's about the choices we make and who benefits from those choices. And in this case, VAT, as I said, is a regressive tax, which is one that's going to hurt ordinary South Africans the most.
Hmm. And I think this brings me back to a conversation where we had with regards to, salary increase. A 10% for someone who's earning 1,000 rand versus a 10% for someone who's earning more than like 100,000. It's never the same in that sense. And you can only imagine the implications of a VAT, as much as it is quite universal in that sense. But the implications of it, it's not really the same in that sense. But just this brings me back to what you mentioned earlier on in terms of looking at, economic recovery versus, hindering or rather driving inflation. In your opinion, is there a more effective and equitable way to raise revenue?
Yes, absolutely. There is. And I think our finance minister was being a bit disingenuous when he said to the nation that he had looked at all the alternatives and nothing was feasible. The question is feasible for whom? Now, let's take, for example, a wealth tax. So if we were to put a 1% tax, 1%, a raise in tax rates on those who are the top 1% of earners in our country, they would complain. They would feel a little bit of pain, but they would basically shrug it off eventually. And that could bring in more than the VAT increase has basically, or at least equivalent to what the VAT increase will bring into the coffers. We could also have, which has been debated in many contexts, we could have a capital gains tax, which has been implemented in many countries, including in the European Union, where corporations pay a small percentage of extra tax on capital gains, the profits and the gains. And we've had, if you look at some of the sectors in our economy, not all of them, but some of them have done very well for themselves over the last many years. Record profits, record remuneration packages for executives. And then they tell the ordinary worker that they must be, watching their pennies and counting their cents. And so it's a bit hypocritical, I think, when we talk about that. There's another potential tax, which is a very controversial one, but nonetheless one that could be considered, which would be, for example, we have in our country a government employees pension fund that is fully funded. We're one of the few countries in the world that has that. What that means is that if tomorrow every single civil servant was to basically decide to retire, we could pay them off. You could pay their entire retirement packages. Normally, most retirement funds look at about 60% coverage. So there are billions and billions and hundreds of billions of rands that is sitting there, which is making money for some people, but not really being used productively. And that could also be tapped, even though that is a controversial move. So there's another source of revenue there. Of course, there are many other sources of revenue in terms of excise taxes, customs, luxury taxes, which the government is loath to increase, as well as income tax. But generally speaking, I think the ones I've mentioned would be the crucial ones that could be alternatives. And I think the case could be made that in a country where almost 60 to 70% of the wealth is controlled by less than 10% of the population, that we have a duty, a moral duty, an economic and political duty to redistribute some of that wealth. And not in a sense of taking it away from people, but in a sense that understanding that if we redistribute some of that wealth from the top down, it increases the possibility for people to be able to be economically productive, to buy goods, to grow the economy. We have an economic, how should we say, mantra or an economic ideology that says you must do everything that the corporations and the markets tell us to do, and therefore then they'll create jobs. It hasn't been working. So we need to try something different. And I think that it requires some political will, which our government at the moment doesn't seem to have.
I think this brings us back to many founding fathers of economy, where whenever the economy was sinking, they were looking at ways of how they can, try create that balance rather than, extracting more from those who are without. But there's something that I want to come back to, which is wealth tax. We understand that we are of this understanding that a lot of people are of this perspective that if we tax the wealthy, then it will, result in them, leaving the country, or rather channeling their funds through, those offshore accounts in that sense. What is your take on that?
Well, you raise a very important point, and here's another source which I failed to mention of revenue collection, which is stemming the illicit flow of funds abroad. We are losing hundreds of billions of rands a year in misinvoicing, in basically offshore accounts that are not declared for the tax purposes, illegal activities that are taking place under the guise of shifting funds and basically profits. This was the case, for example, if listeners and viewers will remember, leading up to the Maracana massacre. After that, it was exposed that lawmen had been taking hundreds of millions of rands and putting it offshore. And then they said, we can't afford to give a 12.5% increase to workers. So that is, in a way, what we need to do is plug those holes. And if those holes are plugged, we could raise the kind of revenue that we're talking about with VAT. But to the broader point that you make in terms of the redistributive aspect and this sort of argument that we can't touch those that are at the top because they'll run away. Well, what we're finding out now in our world is that globally, the grass is not always greener on the other side. Where there's money to be made, that's where people will be, and capitalists in particular who want to make money. South Africa, people are making a lot of money. The question is, it's too small of an amount of people that are making that money. If we want to have an economy that is going to grow, if we want to have an economy that is going to benefit most, then we need to grasp this reality that those who have benefited historically and otherwise need to give up a little bit more. It's not about taking away, but it's about sharing. And this notion that we are as a dog-eat-dog world and everybody must look out for themselves, this is leading us to more conflict and more problems. So I think in the context of South Africa, we have opportunities to redress those historical imbalances and do so through tax collection ways that basically tell people that if they make those contributions a little bit more, then we'll have less conflict, we'll have greater peace, we'll have more growth. So the economic arguments can be made, I think, much more convincingly than the opposite ones that you mentioned in terms of not touching those at the top.
Now, just to close off our conversation, Dr. Dale, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Earlier on, you mentioned that the government, there are other alternatives, but the government just, is not really looking into them. What would you say are some of the reasons behind not looking into those other avenues, as well as any closing thoughts with regards to our conversation around VAT hikes?
Sure. I would say that, unfortunately, the main reason why the government is not considering those others is because they are mostly of the same view as those who are at the top of the economic pyramid. I mean, let's be honest. The vast majority of our politicians, it's a revolving door between the private sector, the corporates, and the political world. They go play at the same golf courses. They belong to the same social clubs. They basically invest in the same kinds of stock markets. They're the ones that have capital and money. And as a result, they see the world in a very specific way. And I think that they do not understand. When those blue light brigades breeze through informal settlements and past townships, I don't think people begin to understand how people are struggling and how people are living. So I think that's the main reason, is because we have a massive gap between those that are at the top and the ordinary folks. And people simply think that if you just continue to do what you've done always, it'll eventually work. And I don't think that's going to work. It's simply not working for us. It's not working for many other countries. And my last comment would be, given what's happening in our world right now, with all the uncertainties, it's even more imperative that we begin to basically bite this bullet, so to speak, in terms of redistribution. Because if we don't, then I'm afraid that we're going to join many other countries in basically being a country which doesn't have any kind of moral direction or political direction to it, but it's simply about who's the strongest, who has the most money. Those are the people that win. That's not the kind of world I don't think that most of us want to live in, nor a country.
I know, Dr. Dale, I said this is my last question, but I need to just fit in one last question, because I did promise our viewers in terms of, tips and tricks on how to, live through this VAT increase. In your view, considering, low income, middle, as well as high income earners, in your view, what are the other, actual ways of really living through this VAT increase?
Well, I think that we need to rediscover our collective consciousness. We've lived in a society which tells us that individual is all that counts, that you must do it on your own. And I think when we come together as collectives, as communities, we help each other. We saw this during COVID. We saw communities coming together. We saw people, we've seen Gift of the Givers as an example, doing tremendous work. And what that does is, when we start helping each other, whether that's with food, whether that's with transport, whether that's with a whole range of things that are necessary on a day-to-day basis, it changes the economy. It basically makes it one where people who have a collective power, economic power, can help each other, as opposed to each of us struggling individually and thinking that we have to make it on our own. So I think that would be something that I think we need to rediscover. We've done this in the past in our history, and it's imperative that we do it again and rediscover that collective sense that building a nation is not an individual enterprise, it's a collective one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dale, for sharing such incredible insight when it comes to just understanding, VAT hikes, its impacts, as well as just understanding the fact that there are other ways in terms of tapping into, ensuring that, there is wealth redistribution, there is a sense of economic growth without really burdening those who are already burdened by certain or other current circumstances. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Viewers at home, that was my guest, Dr. Dale T. McKinley, who is an economist with experience in financial analysis, and more so, he has a unique combination of academic knowledge and real-world expertise in the South African economy. I hope that was quite insightful for you, as it was insightful for me. But for now, let's head over to an ad break. We'll see you just after this.